Our next presenter is Mr. Andy Rayner, who is with Nevion, and he's going to be giving us a presentation about timing in IP production. So take it away, Andy. There you go.
Thank you very much, Wes, and good day. Is it afternoon yet here? It's just afternoon. I can say good afternoon. It's great to be at NAB 2023. I was reflecting as I get started on the last time I was presenting at the IP Showcase back at IBC at the end of last year, and it was the day after Queen Elizabeth died. So I thought it was appropriate to kick off with looking forward, because in less than 3 weeks' time, it's the coronation of King Charles III. So that's coming up in the UK. So that's the news and stuff that we're helping to prepare for at the moment. Also, before I get into the topic for now, just 3 plugs for stuff that's up and coming that I'm involved on the IP Showcase in the next few days. So tomorrow, Monday, 3:30 in the afternoon, I'm talking about compression in IP production. On Tuesday at 12:30, I'm talking about some case studies of different types of distributed IP production deployments. And then later that afternoon, which is a good adjunct to this session I'm talking about now, along with a friend and colleague in the industry, John Mayall, we're doing a meetup session, which is ran behind here, on timing in IP production. So if you're able to join any of those sessions, that would be really great. Okay, so timing in IP production. I'm going to be covering a couple of different topics here. Some of it is a bit of a rethink, some principles, just to remind you of why we do some of the things we do, and maybe why we shouldn't do some of the things we do. And then we're going to move on to look at some of the elements of how the future may be looking and what we need to consider in timing, and maybe some of the things we can lose the shackles on in timing as we move forward. But before I get into that, I wanted to, I'm in the right place. I've got this is one of the slides I use a lot to talk about distributed production. The IP transformation of production that we started maybe 8 years ago really was initially swapping out SDI infrastructure for 10 gig fiber that did largely the same thing. So the benefits we realized at that point was format, spatial and temporal resolution agnostic transport without bespoke video or audio interfacing. But the real transformational workflow benefit of doing IP production is now realized, because we now actually have IP connectivity in the wired area as well as the local area, and that means we can do these 3 Ps, which is the places, the processing, the people can all be located wherever you want. And that really is truly transformational, and lots of the deployments, this is probably really only coming into full throw in the last couple of years. We're actually seeing people really leverage true business benefit from IP production. Now we've got this 3 Ps of distributed production architecture. Now, so the DPP did some work a couple of years ago. In fact, it was during lockdown. I think I was part of the sessions here to look at the different models on how distributed, or as they were calling it at the time, remote production is done. And these really are the models of the different architectures of how we can distribute the acquisition, the processing and storage, and the control. And if you think back to some of the lockdown models, the way people were doing a lot of remote control, but still having the processing, storage, and acquisition in the same locations, but all of these models apply. And there's a DPP models on the left, but also on this side, we've got some additional models, which are different variants that we've put together that we've seen in real-world deployments since then. And the code is down there. These slides, by the way, are available after the show, so do feel free to look towards them. So going back to the thinking about the actual distributed production architecture, we're going to be looking at some of the timing issues on here as well. I just want to draw your attention in to this. This is just a different way of looking at that 3Ps environment, but also just wanted to point out things like the 5G infrastructure, which is something that's coming into play as well now, and also the differentiation between potentially public cloud and private cloud storage. So back to time. Lots of people have had opinions on time over the years. These are just a few famous quotes, but just to get us kicking on thinking about synchronization and why we need to synchronize things in time, when timing really first started mattering. So the thing that really drove that was the railroads or the railways, because that's the first point. Different people in different locations needed to actually have some synchronization of time and know what common time was. And in the early days, if those of you that are as old as I am will recognize different ways which we used to actually obtain time. So there was the speaking clock. You used to dial up and pay a premium rate to actually just have someone telling you the time on a pre-record. We had obviously watches, some of which could be synchronized to timing references. And then we have the radio, which we could listen to and hear the classic time signals. But in the world we've moved into now, what is real time is actually blurring. So just to look at this, so the Greenwich time signal, in the UK we have the pips on the hour. Now, in the distribution for both FM radio, analog radio, and digital broadcasting, DAB, there are some very tight constraints to make sure that when you hear those pips, you're within like 100 milliseconds of when the pips actually occur. And I used to think that was really good. And when I had an analog watch, I used to enjoy setting it, to the pips. But now I actually stream my audio over a Sonos speaker in the house, or many Sonos speakers in different parts of the house, which are typically buffered maybe 10, 15 seconds. So my pristine absolute time is really blurring. Most streaming services, when you view YouTube, there's a large amount of buffering that's happening to give you a good experience there. So real time is really blurring. But I want to just go back to something I did comment on a couple of years ago. The bottom right picture here is Logie Baird's original Telecine live television demo that he did in 1938. And the reason that's amusing is the only way he could do, because he used a flying dot scanner, the only way he could actually create that was to actually have a film being taken, developed in real time, and then telescanned in the dark. So he actually had a 42-second latency from the camera on the studio floor, which was a film camera, through that real-time development loop into the live video that was actually put out. So if we think long latency is a thing for now, there were challenges even like 90 years ago. So how do we keep things in sync now? We've actually had the ways of doing timing reference for a long time. In the US, there's a timing reference there which allows people to actually set all manner of devices. Obviously now, typically most of what we're doing is GNSS based, so the different types of satellite based synchronization from different locations run by different countries. And that's allowed us, both in our SDI and analog video world, to actually have GPS synchronization. And now, obviously, we have PTP timing, which derives its synchronization, its absolute time information, from the GNSS reference. And what that means is, fundamentally, wherever we're located, we actually can be confident that we have frequency synchronism with other locations wherever they are in the world, and typically wherever they are within the nation or across the continent where we're using it. So the kind of way that we've actually done timing distribution is, whether it's been with Blackburst or whether it's been with PTP for how we do IP for 2110, then we've had a timing reference distribution function, which has either been a separate Blackburst reference or we've actually distributed PTP through the network. And every device in that infrastructure has actually had that pristine timing information made available to it. That's what we're doing for 2110 infrastructure now, and that actually works very well. What I want to challenge with this diagram is what is absolutely necessary for timing. And you'll see in a few slides' time as I move through to talking about how we're actually going to be doing media processing in almost an entirely software-based environment moving forwards in the way we do production. But there are some fundamentals in IP, in the timing that we need to do. The biggest fundamental and the most important of the whole thing is the acquisition time, the origin time, capturing the time at which all of the cameras and microphones are actually acquiring those signals. And you'll see I put there 5G as well, because there are some debates going on as to when you have got a 5G connected device rather than a fiber connected device, how you actually make sure you've got the absolute time information in the same manner to the same accuracy that we have in a coax or fiber connected system. I'm not going to go into the 5G infrastructure. There are some other talks you can see online I've already done about that. But fundamentally, whether we're wirelessly connected or line connected, we need to make sure that the acquisition point for all of our content is the same. That's very important for multi-camera, and also even more important in terms of the criticality of that timing if you think about microphones. Because if we're trying to create a phase coherent sound image from multiple devices, multiple microphones that are separately connected via either line or via wireless connectivity, then there are some quite demanding timing constraints there, and I'm going to come on to that later. To be controversial, and this is where deviating from possibly what we've been thinking about from that previous slide, the processing time and the timing information required in the processing environment does not actually need to be anywhere near as precise as the acquisition time. As long as we actually are able to understand the amount of time it takes to process things, and when the accumulated, the worst case accumulated timing that creates, we then need a reconstruction time, which may be here, this consumption time, it may actually be at the end of the day in a device. It may be in the television or in the mobile phone or the tablet or whatever you're consuming that on. There may actually be an intermediate point where we're reconstructing that with accuracy. But fundamentally, that's the only other point in the chain when we actually need accurate time. So rewinding through the history of 90 years of television, this is a picture I've used before. This is Betty Bolton, who was the very original person that was scanned. She was in a dark room with a flying dot scanner, and you'll notice the raster scan is vertical rather than horizontal, which we've been doing most of the last 90 years. The point I want to make here is where we've got to with 2110 in the way we do 2110 at the moment is we've still inherited a lot of the legacy of the raster scan. You've heard some of the timing information that some of my friends were presenting on just previously, but fundamentally, the way the timing models work in 2110 with -21, etc., allow for a raster scan architecture. And one of the things we need to think about as we move forward, and again, this is a picture I've been showing a lot in the last 18 months, is the end game of where we're going to be producing. And thinking back to the picture I showed you of the timing model a couple of slides ago, we have acquisition, which needs to be precise and very well time aligned. We have consumption, which needs to actually have reconstituted time. And the only other point that we need to reconstitute the video and the audio from the processes that we're actually, the media processing we're doing, is for those people involved in the production that are human beings that need that video and audio pulled back into a real-time linear workflow. Apart from that, as long as we stay time aware, so we actually make use of those origination timestamps in the clumps of media that we're processing, we don't need to have tight timing there. So in terms of the connectivity, the way we connect the media together, there are three fundamentals about the way we actually do that. First of all, it needs to take a finite time to do it. We need to have a time bound. We need to know how long that connectivity will take to do that. It needs to be integral, as in we need confidence by whatever method that the actual data that we're transferring will get there. And the third thing is it needs to be retimable. And I'll come on to unpack that a little bit more in a minute. There are some questions that are being asked in the community at the moment, and I just want to use this as an example. The VSF has recently released TRO8 and TRO7, and those are both ways of actually transferring or connecting JPEG XS compressed data from a location to another location using the compression. TRO8 is the one which uses 2110-22, so it's part of the 2110 suite, and it's essence-based. So it's all about carrying that video as a 2110 essence and actually carrying that across. TRO7 is actually packing both that video, that compressed video essence, but the associated audio and other data flows into what I call a traditional, because it's been around a long time, a traditional transport stream. The difference about these is the way the clocking works, and I'm just going to unpack that a little bit now. So we have in the 2110 environment, effectively the concept where we have, and this could be a facility, or it could just be an acquisition-only location where we're acquiring data. But the requirement, effectively, if you're in a 2110 ecosystem, is the event location needs to have absolute timing information available to it to actually do a standard 2110 deployment. So you have a timing reference. Now that could be a local GNSS reference, or it could be long-haul timing over some other mechanism. But whichever way, it needs to have that, because the timing information on acquisition needs to be there and reconcilable. The more traditional way of doing transport stream is what I call an adaptive source timing recovery. So typically, this is where TRO7 comes in, you actually encapsulate the video and the audio and the other data in a transport stream, and that can be adapted, and that means you don't need to have timing information available at the event location, but you effectively need to do effectively in the IP world a frame synchronization function to reconcile your non-synchronous event location timing into the production system you're doing. So you have to do that timing reconciliation. So thinking about that timing reconciliation a little bit more briefly, I just want to think about locked and non-locked sources and how we actually do that. So within a facility, the timing nuances, the timing differences are going to be very, very small. We're talking about microseconds worth of propagation delay, or tens of microseconds worth of propagation delay within the plant. And then maybe a couple of switches, so maybe a few more tens of microseconds. But fundamentally, we're in the game order of hundreds of microseconds as being the timing variation that we're seeing. Once we start doing distributed production, as I've been talking about, so we're long hauling, then we're dealing with the speed of light in fiber becoming quite dominant. Now, the speed of light in fiber is pretty damn fast. It's 200 kilometers per millisecond. So, within a country, you're probably only talking about the order of a handful of milliseconds of timing. But that does, if you want to think about, if we've got our two GNSS reference timing planes at the two locations, that does mean we have potentially a significant phase shift. It's probably a fraction. I need to stay close. Do I need to stay close? Wes is telling me I need to stay close to this microphone. I'm used to holding it, so I'm not used to the constraints here. So we've got these two locations where you've got a fairly significant time offset. Typically, that's going to be the order of a fraction of one video frame. But we only have to, in a 2110 environment, do phase reconciliation, because we can be confident that we've got frequency synchronism. So the phase offset means effectively we would have a buffer that phase shifts us to the point that the signal is then accommodatable for use within the receiving facility. Obviously, and this is where the kind of TRO7 world comes in, we have like asynchronous rogue sources. So these are sources typically nowadays in a production, that might be what happens with a radio camera, because typically a radio camera is not gen locked. It's actually a free running acquisition device, which then is frame synchronized into the timing. And that's what we do in a traditional SDI world, let alone the IP world, where we're doing something similar. So if we're using TR07, then we would treat those sources, those long-haul sources, as those rogue devices, those asynchronous devices, because we cannot rely on that. So those are the two main mechanisms that we're thinking about there. So thinking about time alignment and what's important here. So there are a few different orders of magnitude of accuracy of time alignment that we need to do within a production. So we've got here typically audio video lip sync. I think probably thinking would be if we're within 5 milliseconds, that's probably a reasonably acceptable tolerance. But it's the order of a few milliseconds of timing between video and audio. If we're actually looking at coherent audio, assuming we're in a 48 kilohertz sampling world, then we need to be better than 20 microseconds in alignment to actually know that we've got sample level accuracy. Now, we don't necessarily always need to have sample level accuracy with audio alignment, but if we're creating phase coherent images, it's absolutely essential we have sample level accuracy. And then the other timing level there is in terms of the delivery time. Most of the situations we're looking in, probably it's the order of a frame accuracy of actually alignment if we're actually doing program time delivery. So those are three examples there. I now want to move on to look at timing planes in production and give a little plug in a minute. So this is a picture I've used a couple of times in the last year to actually demonstrate some points here. Well, I've got T0 there, which is my acquisition time. And what I'm trying to show with examples here is a number of different processes in the production chain, some just due to equipment processing time and others due to creative requirements that actually introduce significant latency and create what I call new timing planes for us to consider. So we've got there a production switcher. Now in the SDI world, and I'll come on to this in a minute, that probably used to be the order of 1 or 2 video lines of latency for a production switcher. In the 2110 world, as it is today, unfortunately, that's by necessity of the way people have implemented a whole video frame of latency. It doesn't need to be that. I'm going to make a plug at the end. But then we've then got remote control surfaces. So if I'm located far away, then possibly I may be introducing, because of the remote surfaces, maybe 100, 200 milliseconds of latency. If I'm actually having remote commentary done for an event that's being back injected, that loop, by the time you've created a proxy, taking it OTT, pulled it back in, come back, this may be the order of a second that I'm introducing to actually add in a remote commentary. If I'm actually creatively deciding I need to add a profanity delay in, then that's going to be several seconds of latency I'm intentionally adding into the process before I've created my final program. And then augmented or virtual reality sets. Typically, there's multiple frames of latency that are incurred by doing that because of the render time of the AR or VR system. So my final play-out chain point, by the time I've actually allowed for, not necessarily all of these, but some of these, there's going to be a timing plane here, which may be, if it's just a tight local facility, that may be like 5 or 6 video frames after T0. If I'm actually doing profanity delay as well, that could be several seconds after my T0 time. But there are different timing planes that I'm allowing for. And what we need to be able to do is to reconcile the 2110 essences in these different points. So I have this noddy picture I've been using again for a good probably 18 months now, showing the different times here and the accumulation of different processing functions in the very simple example here of a video flow and an audio flow, where the video flow is being typically subject to quite a lot more latency probably than the audio flow. So to actually use these two essences in synchronism downstream, I'm going to need to apply some additional buffering, probably more likely here to the audio, to actually be able to reconcile them. But the key question is, how do I know what the different latency, the different buffering that I need to apply here if I'm not able to propagate, or if the system is not propagating the origination time there, that's being the point at which it's being sampled, which I talked about earlier. Also want to say that the same principle applies. This is what I would call typical appliance-based processing equipment. The same principles apply in a virtualized world where we've got software functions. Typically, these are not quite as neat in terms of the time to execute, but we do know we can actually evaluate or allow for a Tmax, a Tmax processing time. So there are a few things that we maybe forgot in the original 2110 that we've actually made some recompense for in the new revision, specifically of -10, which actually allow you to communicate some of that information. Specifically, it's all about the preservation of timing information, the preservation of origination time. And that's actually more of a challenge, as I said, with compute, where you've actually got a less deterministic processing function, but we can actually allow for those Tmaxes. Just skipping through here, there's some processing here. And if we accumulate compute functions, we've actually got more time to look at. Why is -21 so critical? I'll just run through this very quickly. It's because fundamentally we have a UDP packet format which is not guaranteed to be transferred. So we need to engineer our switch fabrics and the way the whole infrastructure works so we guarantee we don't lose packets. There is the way we do typically, the way we run with software infrastructure, at the moment, we actually go back to 2110 and we have to have that -21 compliance. We don't necessarily need to do that, and indeed, 2110 is not the ideal way of transferring data when we're in compute. So we have other technologies that actually guarantee us the integrity of workflows in an environment where we're in compute. And what we're looking to do with some work, and a plug for the VSF work that's happening here called the GCC-CJ work, is we're trying to standardize the media API. You can hear more about this on the booth a bit later on. Trying to standardize a media API that assumes the integrity and the time-bounded transfer of the data is actually in place as we move forward. And that means we can have these time-bound processing functions which we can concatenate together and actually have a defined end time, or worst case end time. And the work we're doing within SIMPTE, again, a plug for the -11 work that's in progress, talk to me more about this if you like later, is a hybrid system where we actually can allow timing preservation, but we can also use a control system which actually can accumulate these link times and these processing times to actually allow us to do reconciliation of time at any point in that processing that we want. There are some more challenges when we actually going into the cloud and back out. I just want to be controversial by saying we do not need PTP in compute, because as long as the acquisition is accurate and the reconstruction is accurate, everything in between doesn't need that level of accuracy. And as I come into land, I just want to appeal to the industry that we actually sort out the challenges we've got, where everything we do in 2110 at the moment is actually creating integer frames of latency. We do not need to do this. There are mechanisms for us to actually be tighter in timing. So hopefully a whistle stop through a few things to do timing. Very happy to meet you afterwards now, or a plug for Tuesday afternoon at 4:30, where I'll be here with my friend John, and we can talk through various elements here as we think about the essentials of the different parts of timing in the process. And very, very finally, I'd like to invite you to come to the Sony stand, where I'm going to be a fair bit of the time during the show, and I'll take you for a nice cup of tea if you would like. Or if you're ever in the UK, do come and join me. Thank you very much. And that's me for now. See you tomorrow at 3:30 when I'm going to be talking about compression in IP production. So see you then. Thank you very much. Back to Wes.